If you need to access a database in your application, which most often you do, you need a persistence framework. With the persistence framework, you'll be able to load your objects from or save them to a database. Now, you can write this persistence framework yourself using plain ADO.NET classes like SQL Connection, SQL Command, and SQL Data Reader, or you can use an existing persistence framework. But writing a persistence framework from scratch is very costly. You'll have to write a lot of stored procedures, read the data using ADO.NET objects, and manually map your database tables and records to the domain objects in your application. And this is where Entity Framework shines. Entity Framework is essentially a persistence framework that frees you from all this dirty work. You no longer have to write stored procedures, well, in most cases, or manage database connections, or manually map the database tables and records to your domain objects. Entity Framework takes care of all of this for you. And that's what I'm going to teach you in this course. In this section, I'm going to introduce you to various workflows to build a model using Entity Framework. And then I'm going to show you a demo of database first and code first, so you get an idea of the process. Just to let you know, this section is purely an introduction to these workflows. Over the next few sections, I will cover each workflow in detail. So let's get started. In this section, I'm going to show you Entity Framework in action, so you can quickly get an idea of what it is like to build a data access layer using Entity Framework. As part of this section, I'm going to introduce you to various workflows when using Entity Framework. That is, database first, code first, and model first. By the end of this section, you will have a high-level understanding of Entity Framework, and then from next section onwards, we'll be covering the details. So let's get started. So there are three workflows to build a domain model using Entity Framework: database first, code first, and model first. With database first, of course, we start with the database. So we design our tables using visual designers and then have Entity Framework generate the domain classes based on the database. This is the traditional approach that a lot of developers have been doing for years. With code first, of course, we start with the code. So we simply create our domain classes and then have Entity Framework generate the database for us. This approach was introduced in more recent years and is still new to many developers. And finally, we have the model first approach. With this approach, we use a visual designer in Visual Studio to model our classes and their associations, some kind of UML diagram. Then, based on this diagram, Entity Framework will generate the domain classes and the database for us. I personally am not a fan of this approach, and I'm not going to explore it in this course, mainly because the visual designer for modeling classes is very poor. And to be honest, I have hardly seen anyone building software that way. So our two main choices here are database first and code first. Now, over the next two lectures, I will show you each of these workflows in action. And then I will give you some guidelines about the strengths and weaknesses of each approach. Hi guys, Mosh here. Thank you for watching my video. I just wanted to let you know that this video you've been watching is part of my complete Entity Framework course on Udemy. In this course, over almost 7 hours, you will learn how to use Entity Framework to build a data access layer for your applications. I'm going to teach you how to build a domain model using both the database first and the code first workflow. You're going to learn about code first migrations to upgrade or downgrade your database. You're going to learn how to override code first conventions using data annotations and Fluent API. You're going to learn how to query data using LINQ, both using query syntax and extension methods. I'm also going to talk about eager loading, lazy loading, and explicit loading. You're going to learn how to add, update, and remove objects. And along the way, I will also talk about some of the best practices when using Entity Framework, as well as additional tools that help you profile and troubleshoot your applications. If you're interested, you can get this course with a discount using the link in the video description. All the best and have a great day. Okay, in this lecture, I'm going to show you database first workflow in action. So I'm going to start with creating a simple table, and then I will have Entity Framework generate a domain class based on that table. So let's get started. So here in SQL Server Management Studio, I've got a database called Database First Demo. I'm going to create a new table. I'm going to use this table for storing posts in a blog. Okay, I'm back and the table is ready. Now, here's the tricky part of database first approach. We have this database here locally, but in order to bring a different database, like a test database or a production database, to this version, we need a mechanism. There are tools out there that can compare two databases and bring them to the same version. But in my experience, they are not always reliable and can sometimes cause issues due to dependency between tables and records. A more reliable, flexible, but unfortunately more manual approach is to create a change script every time we make a change to our database. Then we can store these change scripts somewhere in the repository and run them on any database to bring them to the current version. So in this demo, I'm going to go with that approach. So I'm going to create a change script here. And I'm going to store this as, here's a sequence number and a description. Okay, and finally, I'm going to save this table. Okay, so the table is ready in my database. Let's refresh. Beautiful. Now I'm going to go to Visual Studio, create a new project, and import this database and its tables into my project. Okay, so start with a new project. I'm going to stick to a console application for now because we don't want to get distracted by the complexity of web applications or WPF applications. So let's just keep it simple and focus on Entity Framework. Database first, demo. Okay, with a new project, the first step is to install Entity Framework. And to do that, we use Package Manager Console. So Tools, New Get Package Manager Console. So we run install package Entity Framework. Beautiful. So here I got Entity Framework version 6.1.3. Now we go to Solution Explorer. Right-click the project. Add. New item. ADO.NET Entity Data Model. So this is going to be our conceptual model that represents the mapping between the database tables and our domain classes. So I'm going to give it a name like block model. And in this window, I'm going to use Entity Framework Designer from database because I already have a database. Next. And here we need to specify a connection to our database. So Microsoft SQL Server, continue. Okay, here's my database. Test the connection. Beautiful. Okay. Next. So at this point, Entity Framework looks at our database and discovers the tables, views, stored procedures, and functions we have there. So currently we only have tables. And here's my table. So I'm going to tick all of this and leave the rest as is. Finish. You get this security warning about running this template can potentially harm your computer. Don't worry about it. So just click do not show this message again because Visual Studio is trying to run a template to generate some code. I'll show you that in a second. Okay, here's our entity data model, which is stored in a file with the EDMX extension. And here you see a class called post, which is exactly like the table I created earlier. Let's go to Solution Explorer. Okay, let's expand blog model EDMX. What you see here is all designer generated code. There are two parts that are important here. What is the first one? blogmodel.context.tt. So TT stands for T4 template. It's a way to generate code based on a template. If we expand this, we see the actual generated code. So here's a C# class that Entity Framework generated for me. And this class derives from dbContext. dbContext is a class that is an abstraction over the database. So it provides a simple API to load the data from or save it to the database. Now I scroll down a little bit. Look, we have a property of type dbSet called posts. A dbSet represents a table in the database. So because in our database we have a table called posts, here we have a dbSet of type post called posts. Now this post class you see here is again generated code. So back to Solution Explorer. This was the context template. So here's the template. And the code that you just saw, this dbContext, was generated based on this template. Now let's take a look at the other template, blog model template. So here's the template code. And if we expand this, we see the post class. Look, it has 4 properties based on the columns I currently have in the database. So the key thing here is we started with a database, we created our table, and then we imported that into our entity data model. Every time I want to make a change in my model, I start with the database. And then I come back to my EDMX file or entity data model and refresh it. And at this point, Entity Framework will update my domain classes as you see here. So here's the database first workflow. Okay, now let me show you how we can use a dbContext to work with the database. And this applies to both database first and code first. So I'm going to close all the windows here. Okay. Then I go to Program. Here I'm going to create an instance of our dbContext class, which is called Database First Model Entities. Now I'm going to create a new post and initialize it here. Now, in a real-world application, most often we'll use an identity column, so we don't have to specify an ID here. But for now, it doesn't matter because I just want to show you the workflow. And finally, I'm going to add this post to our dbSet and save the changes. So context.posts.add. So we add it to the dbSet, and at this point, changes are only in the memory. Nothing is committed to the database yet. So context.save changes. That's it. Now let's run the application. Done. So as easy as that. Note that I did not have to write a store procedure. I did not have to work with ADO.NET classes like SQL connection and SQL command. Entity Framework took care of all of this for me. Now let's verify that it worked. So I'm going to go to Management Studio. And let's take a look at our table. There you go. We got this record in the database. Now, reading data from database is as easy as what you saw. And that's what I'm going to cover later in this course. So this was database first workflow in action. In the next lecture, I'm going to show you code first. And then I will do a comparison between the two. Okay, in this lecture, I'm going to show you the code first workflow in action. So here in Visual Studio, I'm going to create a new console application and call it code first demo. Okay, now, similar to last lecture, we need to install Entity Framework. So, Tools, NuGet Package Manager, and Package Manager Console. Install package Entity Framework. Beautiful. Okay, now back to the program. Now, with code first, of course, we start with the code. So I'm not going to go to Management Studio and create a new database. Instead, I'm going to create a new class called Post. So this Post class looks exactly like the one that Entity Framework generated for me as part of database first workflow. But in this lecture, I created it by hand. Now, in companion to this class, I also need a DB context. Remember DB context? It's an abstraction over the database that we use to load or save data. So, basically, all we have to do here is to create a class that derives from DB context and exposed one or more DB sets. In this case, DB set of post. Next, we need to specify the connection string to the database. So we go to app config. And here, I create the connection strings element and add a new connection string. I'm going to call this the same name as my DB context. So blog DB context. And the actual connection string is in this case, I'm using SQL Express. You might be using a different engine. So you create a connection string that works for you. So initial catalog is the database name, and integrated security means I'm using Windows authentication. Now, one more element we need to add to this connection string, and that is provider name, which should be system.data.sql client. This is required to work with code first. Okay, next, I'm going to go to Package Manager console. We need to enable code first migrations. So this is a command that we run only once for the lifetime of a project. So enable migrations. So code first migrations enabled for project code first demo. Beautiful. Now, out of these few steps I have done so far, installing Entity Framework, adding the connection string, and enabling migrations are steps that we do only once. That's it. Every time we want to make a change in our model, we start with the code. So in this case, for example, we create a new class like post or modify an existing class. The possibilities are endless. Now, every time we make a change to our model, we need to create a migration. So we go to Package Manager console and use the command add migration. And here we need to specify a name that represents the kind of change we have made. In this example, I created the post class. Let's see what happened. So I go to Solution Explorer. Look, we've got a new folder called Migrations. And inside this folder, we've got two files. The first one is my migration. Note that it has a date timestamp and a description. And this is very similar to the migration script that we created manually last time. Remember, I had to create a change script? This is exactly the same process, but in a more automated fashion. Let's see what's inside this file. So interestingly, we don't have any SQL code here. This is plain C# code. This class, createPost, derives from DB migration, and it has two methods, up and down. So the first one is used to upgrade database, and the second one is used to downgrade database. So with code first migrations, we can take any database and take it to any version, whether that version is higher or lower. And this is very powerful. If you're maintaining different versions of an application, this is going to be your best friend. Now let's see what's happening inside the up method. So there is a call to this method, createTable. It tries to create a table called posts with these columns. So ID, which is an integer, it's not nullable, and its identity. Date published is a date time, and it's not nullable. And we have two more columns, title and body, they both are a string. And finally here, there is a call to primary key method, which specifies that the ID column should be set as primary key. So the interesting thing here is Entity Framework uses convention over configuration. So when it looks at our model, in this case our post class, based on the name and type of our properties, it can figure out how the database should look like. For example, it knows that ID is typically used for the primary key, and often it's an identity column. So it automatically added these expressions here. So we created a code first migration. The next step is to run it. When we run it, Entity Framework looks at the database, detects the current version, which I will show you later, and then figures out what migrations need to run on the database to bring it up to date. Then it gets these migration classes and converts them to SQL code and runs it on the database. So to run the migration, we go back to Package Manager console and run update database. So in this example, it realized that this is the only migration that needs to be run on the database. And of course, it ran it. So let's see the result. I'm going to go back to Management Studio, refresh the databases, and here we have Code First Demo. So I did not have to come here and manually create this database. I just focused on my code, which is much more fun for us developers. So let's expand this. Look, we've got two tables here. Underline migration history, which is used internally by Entity Framework to figure out what migrations have been run on this database. And we also have this posts table with these columns, which looks exactly like the one we created in the database first demo. So as you saw, with the code first workflow, we simply focus on our code and let the Entity Framework take care of generating or migrating the database for us. Every time we want to make a change to the database, again, we start with the code, create a migration, run it, and the database will be updated. So this is the process. In the next lecture, I'm going to give you a comparison of database first and code first. So, database first or code first? Well, in my opinion, that comes back to you and your preferences. Anything you want to do is possible with both code first and database first. There are a number of misconceptions I have heard in the community, especially on Stack Overflow. For example, some developers say database first gives you more control over the database, but this is actually not true at all. With code first, you have full control over the database, even if the kind of change you want to make got nothing to do with your code. Let's say you want to create a trigger or modify the query behind a view, or maybe create or remove a stored procedure. You can do all of this with code first, and I will show you later in the course. I've also heard some people say that code first is good for greenfield projects. And if you have an existing database, you should use database first. Again, this is not right at all because you can reverse engineer your existing database to create a code first model and then use code first migrations for any subsequent changes afterwards. I will show you all of these techniques later in the course. So, here's the question again: database first or code first? Again, to re-emphasize, you can do anything with either of these workflows. But in my opinion, there are a few advantages to using code first. First, you get full versioning of your database. You can bring your database to any version with running only one command. And this is extremely helpful if you're maintaining different versions of an application. Without code first, you either have to manually take care of versioning or use a tool like Redgate's source control. But that's very expensive. With code first, you get this for free. Another advantage is productivity. It's much faster to write code than use the mouse and a table designer. We are programmers, we are not designers. If you're used to visual designers and wizards and clicking, I highly recommend you to change your approach and start to use your keyboard more if you want to be successful. Because successful programmers use their keyboard, they don't use the mouse often. Anyway, code first helps you get things done more quickly. Of course, there's a bit of learning curve at the beginning, and you may run into a number of problems early on. But trust me, all this will disappear after a while, and you're never going to switch back. I have used code first in many projects and even in production, and I've been very happy with it. The only thing is, where you work, you might have a legacy database deployment tool. And for that reason, you may not be able to use code first, because there are certain steps you need to follow to update the database, and everyone in the team has been doing it for a number of years, and maybe they're too lazy to change their approach. Then you have to use database first. If that's the case, you have no choice. But if you have a chance to change the system and influence your team to adopt code first, that's great. Go for it. Or at least give it a try. Don't just stick to the old ways of doing things because some people say that's a better way. Always try different approaches and see what works for you. So in this course, I'm going to teach you both database first and code first, so you can see the differences, try them yourself, and pick one that works better for you. So in the next section, we'll be looking at details of database first workflow. I hope you enjoyed this section, and thank you for watching.